The night was silent in Ouagadougou until the sound of a radio broadcast shattered the stillness. An urgent announcement spread across the capital. Foreign powers had issued an ultimatum that could decide the very survival of Burkina Faso. Imagine being told that within 48 hours, your country must surrender 70% of its gold reserves or pay $5.6 billion, or face crippling consequences. This was no rumor, no wild speculation. It was a demand backed by the authority of the G7, stamped by the International Monetary Fund, and reinforced by the voice of Donald Trump himself. For ordinary families, the fear was immediate and personal. A father of three, sitting in a dimly lit kitchen, counted his last coins and wondered if his children would grow up in a country stripped of its wealth and dignity. A mother, clutching her youngest child, whispered prayers, terrified that their sovereignty was slipping away overnight. In the crowded markets of Ouagadougou, traders lowered their voices, speaking only in fragments. Would Burkina Faso be forced to kneel, just as so many African nations had done before under the weight of global pressure? Or would something different happen this time? At the center of this storm was a young man, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the bold leader of Burkina Faso. The ultimatum landed on his desk on August 21, 2025, delivered under tight security. The room was heavy with silence, every advisor watching for a flicker of his reaction. Would he bend to overwhelming pressure, accepting a fate that seemed inevitable? Or would he resist, knowing that refusal could ignite a storm that might engulf not just Burkina Faso, but the entire Sahel region? This was no ordinary political standoff. It was a test of courage, a battle for dignity, and perhaps the moment that would define a generation. For the people of Burkina Faso, the question was terrifyingly simple. Would their leader stand firm in defense of their future, or would the nation's wealth and pride be sold piece by piece to the highest bidder? And for us watching far beyond Africa's borders, a larger question emerged. What happens when a small nation dares to defy the strongest powers on earth? Stay with us, because what Ibrahim Traoré did next would not only shock his enemies, it would inspire millions who believe in justice and freedom. If you believe these stories matter, don't just listen, carry them forward. The ultimatum of August 21, 2025 was not simply a piece of paper. It was a calculated strike meant to break the backbone of Burkina Faso. The demand surrender 70% of the nation's gold reserves, valued at over $5.6 billion, or face crippling economic and political retaliation. For the Western powers behind it, the G7, the IMF, and even figures like Donald Trump, the calculation was clear. Burkina Faso was a small, landlocked country. They believed it had no chance to resist. But history would prove them wrong. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, just 36 years old, had risen to power less than 3 years earlier during a time of deep crisis. His nation had been battered by years of terrorism, drought, and political instability. Foreign military bases dotted the Sahel, with French, American, and other Western troops claiming to fight extremism. Yet local communities saw little improvement. Instead, Burkina Faso's natural resources, gold, cotton, manganese, were being siphoned off, enriching corporations abroad while ordinary citizens struggled in poverty. The ultimatum was simply the latest chapter in a long story of exploitation. But Traoré's response began with a single phrase: Burkina Faso will not kneel. These words echoed through the corridors of government and into the hearts of ordinary citizens. They were a defiant rejection of the same patterns that had shackled African nations for decades. He knew the risks. Defying the G7 meant sanctions, isolation, and possibly covert operations to destabilize his government. Yet for him, the alternative was worse: surrendering the soul of his country. One farmer from Ouagadougou told a local reporter, "For years, I have worked the land while foreigners took the gold beneath it. If our president says no to them, then for the first time, someone is speaking for us." That farmer's story symbolized the broader struggle. In Burkina Faso, nearly 80% of the population depends on agriculture, while the wealth of the soil, particularly gold, rarely benefits those who till it. The ultimatum threatened to cement this injustice forever. To understand the gravity of the moment, we must look back. In the 1980s, Burkina Faso's revolutionary leader, Thomas Sankara, had resisted foreign influence, demanding African self-reliance. He was assassinated in 1987, and many believe foreign powers played a role. Traoré's defiance revived memories of Sankara's legacy, making many wonder if history was repeating itself. Would another African leader who dared to say no meet the same fate? Western diplomats tried to cloak their demands in the language of stability and debt management, but ordinary Africans saw the truth. Burkina Faso had only $4.2 billion in foreign debt, yet the ultimatum demanded $5.6 billion, more than the debt itself. It was not about repayment. It was about humiliation and control. Traoré's rejection sparked immediate consequences. International banks began restricting Burkina Faso's access to the global financial system. Rumors spread of possible military intervention, disguised as peacekeeping. On social media, supporters and detractors clashed, with hashtags like Nash, Stand with Burkina, and Nashin Traoré Challenge trending across Africa. In the streets of Ouagadougou, thousands rallied, waving flags and chanting, "We will not bow." The ultimatum had backfired. It had awakened the spirit of resistance. But not everyone was convinced. Some elders in the capital worried about food shortages, remembering the hardships of the 1980s. Traders whispered that sanctions could collapse the fragile economy. Even allies in Mali and Niger urged caution, knowing their own countries might be next on the list. The tension was unbearable, as if the entire nation was holding its breath. And then came the pivotal question. If Traoré refused, what would the West do next? Would they unleash sanctions severe enough to starve a population of 22 million? Would they send troops to enforce compliance? Or would they back down, unwilling to risk a confrontation that might ignite the entire Sahel? This was no longer just about Burkina Faso. It was about whether Africa, after centuries of subjugation, could chart its own course. Traoré had lit a fire, but the flames could burn his people just as easily as they could light the path forward. But the real turning point was still to come. As the world waited, one decision by Traoré would escalate the crisis beyond anyone's imagination. But what exactly pushed this standoff into its most dangerous phase? What decision turned resistance into a historic confrontation? The breaking point came when Captain Ibrahim Traoré announced on live television that Burkina Faso would seize control of all foreign-operated gold mines within its borders. The ultimatum from the West had demanded gold. Now Traoré was taking it back. His words were calm, but the effect was like a thunderclap. The wealth beneath our soil belongs to our children, not to foreign powers. From this day forward, Burkina Faso controls its own destiny. In Ouagadougou, thousands poured into the streets, waving flags, singing the national anthem, and even crying tears of relief. For decades, foreign corporations had run the gold sector, with 80% of profits leaving the country. Now, the president was saying enough. One young student shouted to a reporter, "This is our Sankara moment," linking Traoré to the memory of Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary hero who once stood against the same forces of dependency. The announcement spread across Africa like wildfire. In Bamako, Mali, citizens held candlelight vigils in solidarity. In Nami, Niger, protesters carried signs that read, "Burkina fights for all of us." Across the Sahel, the mood was one of unity and defiance. But in Western capitals, the reaction was very different. In Washington, senior officials convened an emergency meeting at the National Security Council. CIA analysts warned that if Traoré's actions went unchecked, other African countries might follow suit, undermining decades of Western influence in the region. In Paris, French officials denounced the move as economic sabotage. Former President Donald Trump, speaking at a rally, blasted Traoré as a dangerous young dictator who doesn't know his place. These words inflamed anger across Africa, where many saw Trump's comment as proof that the West still viewed Africans as subjects, not equals. Back in Burkina Faso, the decision triggered both euphoria and fear. Markets in Ouagadougou erupted in chaos as traders worried about international sanctions. Prices of imported goods like rice and fuel spiked overnight. Mothers lined up at bakeries, anxious about feeding their children. A shopkeeper named Adama described the dilemma. "I am proud of our president, but I fear hunger. Can we survive the cost of this freedom?" His voice captured the bittersweet reality of independence. National pride clashing with personal hardship. The military, meanwhile, stood firmly behind Traoré. Images of young officers saluting him spread across television screens, reinforcing the sense that this was not just one man's decision, but a collective stand. Soldiers patrolled the capital, ensuring calm amid rumors of possible sabotage or even a coup attempt. The international media painted sharply contrasting pictures. Western outlets warned of radicalism and regional instability. African broadcasters hailed the moment as a turning point for the continent. On social media, hashtags like Africa Rising and Traoré Challenge trended globally, sparking debates from New York to Johannesburg. But the real tension came from whispers of foreign intervention. Reports emerged that private military contractors backed by Western interests were being positioned in neighboring countries. Satellite images leaked online appeared to show troop movements along the Niger-Burkina border. The threat was no longer hypothetical. As Traoré stood before cheering crowds in Ouagadougou, his defiance carried the weight of history. For many older citizens, the scene recalled the independence struggles of the 1960s, when African nations broke free from colonial rule. Yet this felt different. The enemy was not colonialism in name, but economic domination in practice. And this time, the stakes were higher, because Burkina Faso stood alone. In a dramatic moment during his speech, Traoré raised a handful of soil and declared, "This land is ours." Not theirs, the crowd roared, but the world watched with unease. Every decision, every cheer, seemed to edge the Sahel closer to a confrontation no one could predict. But could this bold defiance spark a chain reaction that pulls the entire region, and even global powers, into direct conflict? And if the West decides to act, will the world respond in time to prevent disaster? In the days following Traoré's shocking announcement, the streets of Burkina Faso carried a mix of pride and strain. On one side, people celebrated a rare moment of sovereignty. On the other, they faced the crushing reality of sanctions, shortages, and rising prices. Families in Ouagadougou gathered around small radios, anxiously listening to news reports about what Western nations might do next. Mothers clutched their children tighter, fathers worried about jobs vanishing as foreign companies threatened to pull out. The economic shock was immediate. Imports of fuel and rice, lifelines for daily survival, dropped sharply. Within a week, the price of bread had doubled. At markets, vendors like Miriam, a widow who sold vegetables to feed her 3 children, spoke of the uncertainty. "I am proud that our president stands tall, but each day I wonder if I can keep my family fed." Her struggle symbolized the paradox. National dignity came at a very real human cost. Politically, the shockwaves rippled through the country's fragile institutions. Opposition leaders, once critical of Traoré, found themselves cornered. To attack him now would be seen as siding with foreign powers. Many fell silent, leaving the young captain as the unchallenged center of authority. Yet whispers of dissent grew louder in private. Some politicians questioned whether Traoré's gamble could plunge Burkina Faso into long-term isolation. At the same time, loyalty to Traoré surged within the military. Young officers viewed him as a hero, a leader who had accomplished what older generations only dreamed of. Images of soldiers distributing food to struggling families circulated widely, reinforcing the narrative that the army stood with the people. But behind the scenes, concerns grew about whether the fragile supply system could hold. The crisis also reshaped everyday life. Families began to stockpile whatever they could: sacks of millet, dried fish, even firewood, preparing for harder times ahead. Schools in some rural areas closed due to shortages, leaving children at home. For many elders, the scene evoked painful memories of the 1980s, when drought and foreign dependence left Burkina Faso vulnerable. One grandfather, speaking to a local journalist, said with tears in his eyes, "I lived through hunger before. I do not want my grandchildren to suffer the same fate." Internationally, Burkina Faso's defiance inspired solidarity movements, but also created risks. Mali and Niger expressed open support, while citizens in Senegal and Ghana debated whether their own governments should follow. But foreign investors fled, and aid programs froze. For ordinary people, this meant medicine shortages in clinics and halted infrastructure projects. The same highways and hospitals that symbolized progress now stood unfinished, silent reminders of the costs of independence. Yet amid the hardship, a new sense of unity spread among ordinary citizens. Neighborhood committees organized food-sharing networks. Religious leaders, both Christian pastors and Muslim imams, called for resilience and prayer. Sunday sermons often ended with appeals for strength and faith, drawing crowds who saw in Traoré's struggle a biblical echo of David standing against Goliath. This moral dimension gave hope to a population under strain, reinforcing the idea that Burkina Faso's fight was larger than just economics. It was about dignity and survival. Still, the uncertainty weighed heavily on the nation's political future. Could Traoré transform short-term unity into lasting reform? Or would the mounting hardships erode public support? Some feared that desperation could spark unrest, even civil strife. International observers warned that the Sahel region, already plagued by terrorism and instability, could unravel further if Burkina Faso faltered. As night fell over Ouagadougou, the city lights flickered with intermittent power cuts, a stark reminder of vulnerability. Yet in the dim glow, voices could be heard chanting Traoré's name, a fragile but determined chorus against overwhelming odds. But as the people endure sacrifice for sovereignty, the looming question grows sharper. How will the United States respond to this rebellion against the old order? From Washington to Paris, Traoré's defiance sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles. For decades, Western powers had relied on the African Union as a predictable partner, an institution that spoke the language of compromise and gradual reform. But now one of its member states had shattered that script. Analysts at the Pentagon and State Department convened emergency meetings, weighing what Burkina Faso's new direction meant for U.S. interest in the Sahel. American officials voiced concerns not only about resource security, but also about terrorism. The Sahel has long been a front line against extremist groups, and the U.S. military maintains critical partnerships and bases in the region. If Traoré's policies encouraged other countries to expel foreign forces, the counter-terrorism strategy painstakingly built over 20 years could collapse. One senior defense official, quoted in a leaked memo, warned, "If Burkina Faso succeeds in going it alone, the entire framework of U.S. engagement in West Africa may unravel." Across Europe, reactions were equally unsettled. France, the former colonial power, faced humiliation as its influence eroded further. French media framed Traoré as reckless, while African commentators celebrated him as courageous. Meanwhile, Russia and China quietly courted Burkina Faso, offering partnerships without the strings of Western oversight. This raised alarms in Washington about a new geopolitical competition in Africa, one that could tip the balance of power far beyond the Sahel. Back in the United States, the issue began surfacing in political debates. Some argued that America should respect Burkina Faso's sovereignty and avoid repeating the mistakes of endless foreign entanglements. Others insisted that inaction would embolden rivals and destabilize a region critical to global security. Talk radio hosts reminded older American audiences of past Cold War standoffs, drawing parallels to moments when small nations shifted global dynamics. Ordinary Americans, especially veterans and families of soldiers who had served in Africa, watched closely. For them, the question was not abstract. It was about whether the sacrifices made in the Sahel would now be erased. The echoes of Iraq and Afghanistan were difficult to ignore. Had the U.S. CRs invested years of effort only to see a partner turn away? And so the question now stands, will the United States choose dialogue, pressure, or intervention? Or could Traoré's defiance mark the beginning of a much larger crisis? The story of Ibrahim Traoré and Burkina Faso is not just about one nation's defiance. It is a mirror held up to an entire continent and to the world powers that still shape Africa's destiny. The danger now is not only internal unrest, but regional spillover. The Sahel has become a powder keg, where instability in one country spreads rapidly across borders. History reminds us how quickly local conflicts can spiral into continental crises. The collapse of Libya in 2011 unleashed weapons and fighters that destabilized Mali, Niger, and beyond. Could Burkina Faso's gamble trigger a similar chain reaction? Some analysts warn that if African military alliances do not solidify within the next 3 months, Burkina Faso could stand alone, vulnerable to both extremist attacks and foreign interference. Others whisper a darker possibility, that outside powers may quietly encourage coups or uprisings to reverse Traoré's independence. These are not conspiracy theories. They are scenarios rooted in Africa's past. The shadow of Cold War proxy wars looms large, reminding us that when Africa asserts itself, the great powers rarely remain bystanders. But the heart of this question goes deeper. Is Traoré a symbol of Africa's rebirth, or a leader steering his people into peril? Is he the beginning of a new era of sovereignty, or a target destined to be crushed by forces larger than his small nation can withstand? For ordinary Africans, the answer is measured not in speeches, but in daily life. A father in Ouagadougou wonders if his children will grow up in freedom or fear. A mother in rural Burkina Faso asks whether the crops she plants will feed her family or be sold off to foreign companies. These are the human stakes behind the headlines. And for us, as Americans watching from afar, there is a sobering truth. What happens in the Sahel does not stay in the Sahel. Instability there can reshape migration flows, global energy markets, and even the safety of our own soldiers abroad. So I leave you with this. Is Ibrahim Traoré Africa's hope or its greatest risk? If this story has touched your heart, share your thoughts below. If you believe in justice, dignity, and the strength of a rising Africa, stand with us by spreading this message. We will meet you again in the next story, where truth will speak once more. May God bless Africa, the land of strength, hope, and unyielding will.